Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. A few years ago, I read a novel by John Williams, and the name of the novel, Stoner. Right. Now, let me just hasten to add here, when this novel was published back in 1965, stoner didn't quite yet have the connotation that it does now. It's not a reference to a drug user. The stoner of the title is the name of the main character, William Stoner. And what this novel does, it traces the arc of a life. Stoner begins, he grows up in relative poverty in a kind of a dirt farm in Missouri somewhere. And then over time, he becomes fascinated with literature. He does very well in school. He eventually gets a job teaching English literature at a small college. And it follows his life. Now, I know that doesn't sound really intriguing or perhaps not even particularly interesting, and yet it is. Usually the term a page turner is applied to suspense novels or horror stories or mysteries. But it's not one of those, but it is a page turner. I stayed up all night reading this thing. I couldn't tear myself away from it. I highly recommend it. Maybe I'll do a separate post just on this novel someday. It certainly deserves it. And it got a lot of honors and awards in its own time. But the reason I'm mentioning this novel now is because one of the big takeaways I got from this was how beautifully this novel was written, just in terms of the mechanics of good writing. There's not an unnecessary paragraph or sentence in the entire novel. Every word is chosen with almost a poetic precision. It's a thing of beauty, right? I think if you had to write it and had to produce an abridged edition, a shorter version of this, you wouldn't be able to do it. You take out one paragraph, one sentence even, change one word, it's going to collapse the entire beauty of this novel. And for the longest time after I read this, I thought, I don't think I'll ever read a novel as perfectly written as this one, although I've read many good novels, but this one is just beautifully written. So I thought, well, this is it. This is the best novel ever written. Well, now I've got another one to put on that shelf of the best books ever written, another novel, and that's this one, James by Percival Everett. James has got that, Everett, he kind of masters the mechanics of writing with the same kind of genius that John Williams did in his book Stoner. Everett, of course, he's a very well-known writer. He's written a number of novels. He's won some awards. I believe this one has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. I could be wrong in that. I heard recently that the movie rights have already been gobbled up by probably Steven Spielberg. It's a very popular book. I'm sure it's still in the top 10, maybe the top 5. Everyone is talking about this, it seems. A great many of my fellow booktubers have done postings on this. I think most everybody knows what the idea of the novel is. This is the story of Huckleberry Finn as told from the point of view of the slave Jim. That's the James of the title. And just like Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn, this kind of replicates some of the same major events, and the major characters are all there. Tom Sawyer shows up, Judge Thatcher. Of course, the Mississippi River itself is kind of a character. And a lot of the events that occur in Huck Finn occur in here, but they're all seen through the eyes of Jim. Now, in Mark Twain's book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there are moments when Jim and Huck get separated. And because that book is about Huckleberry Finn, it follows Huck's adventures, and then later on, he and Jim get reunited. In this book, the same thing happens. They're separated, but the focus in this book is on Jim himself. And so we see him struggling to get through the South during a time of slavery and a really grotesque racism and the threat of danger around every corner. He's trying to reunite with his family, perhaps lead them all to freedom somehow. It's a very powerful work. It's not without moments of humor, but it's that kind of cynical humor, something I think Twain would have very much appreciated this book. The two con men from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the Duke and the Dauphin, show up in this to quite humorous effect. But generally speaking, it's a very bleak story. One of the conceits of the story, which is very interesting, is that the slaves are actually very well spoken and highly cultured when they're among themselves. And in fact, when the slaves are among themselves and there's no white people around, Jim becomes James. This is a more dignified name, and he's very well educated. How did he get educated? Well, he tells us that he used to sneak into Judge Thatcher's library late at night and essentially taught himself how to read, and then he read some of the great philosophers of the time, going back to the 18th, 17th, and 16th centuries. So he knows the other slaves. You're not quite sure how they got to, be so well educated and well spoken, but as soon as a white person comes along, they slide into that Southern dialect, and they lower their heads, and they shuffle about and act very subservient. At one point in the novel, I think about 3/4 of the way through, forgive me, I don't know if it's James who explains this or another one of the slaves. He says the reason they're doing this is because they are essentially a conquered people, and when a people are conquered, they are enslaved, and the people, the conquerors, expect the enslaved to take an inferior position in society, and that's what these slaves are doing. They have to kind of maintain this facade of ignorance and downtroddenness and even inferiority, because if they show themselves for the wise and cultured people that they truly are, they will get beaten, perhaps even killed. So that's one of the central tragedies of this. One of the ironies of this is that when it comes right down to it, it's the slave masters. It's the white people who are the ignorant ones, the uncultured ones, the ones who have such terrible grammar. Now, I'm sure that there are some people out there, there's an element of society right now that would look at a book like this and say, oh, it's attacking white people. These are the same kind of people that have embraced that really depraved idea of reverse racism, which is total nonsense. But that's not what this book is really about. I would say two things. First of all, how could you portray a racist white slave owner in anything but negative terms, right? But more than that, I think one of the things Everett is aiming at here is he's trying to show how racism cuts two ways. It's a two-edged sword. It damages the people who are its target, in this case, the black slaves in the South. They have to assume this beaten down personality, and some of them start to absorb it, and they start to, play themselves or cheat themselves out of a richer life because somehow they think they've deserved the status that they're in, and it creates these horrific psychological complexes that will be passed on from generation to generation. But racism also affects the racist. To embrace racism, to become a racist, to view another group of people as somehow inferior to you, also distorts your thinking. It distorts you intellectually and morally. And you actually start to believe that somehow you're superior, even though you might not be, even though you probably, I should say, even though you aren't. So what this indictment of racism in this book, again, it shows how it damages the people who are targeted by the racist, but it also damages the racist. And this kind of intellectual and moral damage can last down through the generations, even to this very day. Again, a very, very powerful book. A couple things, final things I want to mention here. There are moments in this book when James will have hallucinations. He'll see some of the great thinkers from the past and from the Enlightenment, and they'll appear before him, and he'll get into a debate with them as some of these great thinkers, all white Europeans, are trying to defend slavery and racism. And James always gets the better of them. And some of these exchanges are even kind of comical. Let me just refer to one passage here. This is where James encounters John Locke, the great British political philosopher of the 17th century. And John Locke explains to James, this is Locke speaking, the hallucination of Locke. Some might say that my views on slavery are complex and multifaceted. And James says they're convoluted and multifarious. Locke says, well, they're well-reasoned and complicated. James says they're entangled and problematic. Locke says they're sophisticated and intricate. And James says they're labyrinthine and Daedalian. This is that clever wordplay, but ultimately James reveals that he's got the moral high ground here. There's no moral justification for slavery, not ever. It's a wonderful book. Oh, the other thing too, there are moments in this book that kind of reminded me of Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, where these kind of revenge fantasies are played out, where the racists, the really bad guys, finally get what's coming to them. At any rate, I predict that this book will be around for a long time. It will certainly, or it should appear on reading lists in high schools and colleges, and certainly always highlight it in libraries. I saw another booktuber mention that this should always be read in conjunction with Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, and I agree with that. Also, of course, that means with this visibility, there are people that are going to come out of the woodwork and want to ban this book. That's that strain of anti-intellectualism that's been in this country for a very, very long time. And it's also that kind of brazen racism that's raised its head again. But be aware of that and defend this book at all costs. Don't let it be banned ever. Have everyone you know read it, have your children read it, and the generations to come. It's a beautiful work, and I highly respect it and endorse this 100%. That's James by Percival Everett. Okay. That's all I've got for you today. Take care. Talk to you soon.